Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. Happy Thursday, everybody. We're getting through these weeks as much as they're blending together. So my name is Carolyn Knight. I am with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. And last week we kind of delved into the esoteric administration side of birding, but I recognize that's not everybody's cup of tea. So today we're going to be tackling a really persistent challenge that birders of all stripes are going to be encountering, whether you're just starting out and you're still struggling to, tell the difference between a house finch and a house sparrow, or if you've been birding for several years and that's no sweat for you. So, today we're talking about how to find birds, because the fact of the matter is, learning how to ID your birds won't do you a ton of good if you can't find them in the field in the first place. And if you don't see the birds themselves, something like eBird goes from being an incredibly useful tool to help you find the birds and become a better birder to becoming some bizarre form of fantasy birding with a roster of one. And fantasy birding is a thing. You're welcome to explore it. But, if you can get out and do it yourself, it's a lot more fun than living vicariously through the top birders in your area. So, before we talk about observing the birds themselves and finding them, we need to consider our own behavior. It's important to remember that we're not birding in a vacuum. To bird, you have to go into the environment where the birds are, right? And that means that you're becoming part of their environment. You're going to be interacting on some level with these wild animals. And when I say interacting, I don't mean you're going to have a Disney princess moment where it flies into your hand and you have a beautiful shared duet about the wonders of nature, but your very presence is going to be noticed by them, and they're going to react to that. So how are we going to mitigate our impact on these birds and their behavior? Noise is a really important one to pay attention to. While most of the birds we're going to be encountering aren't necessarily going to be scared away by you having a quiet conversation with your friend, that conversation means your focus is not on finding the birds, but rather it's talking to your friend. And that's fine, but it does mean that you may miss some cues that there are birds in your area. And I'm not just talking about the calls and the chatter and the singing that goes on, and that's relatively easy to pick out, but even something as small as the rustling of leaves in the undergrowth when it's a relatively windless day can lead you to a bird that's, relatively cryptic. It's hidden, but you would have missed it if you were having a conversation. A lot of our birds are small. They're going to be hiding. They're not going to be necessarily going out into the middle of the trail, but instead, they're going to be hiding. They're going to be doing their own thing, and part of that is going through the undergrowth where there's a ton of leaves that might block your view. So, listening for those noises, whether they're the large songs that'll help you pinpoint where a bird is, or even listening for the rustle of the leaves that are going to point you to where something is moving. And it might just be a lizard, but lizards are cool too. And you don't want to miss a really nice opportunity to learn more about the nature that you're observing just because you were having a conversation that could have maybe waited. Essentially, don't go birding with a boombox. Bird while you're birding. Another thing that you can pay attention to is your movement. Patience is a birder's best friend. When you go on a bird walk, you're going to notice that the pace is slow. And that's not because we're lazy or we're just moseying along, but it's what allows us to better observe our surroundings. There's a lot of stopping and waiting, and by doing so, we're allowing the birds around us to get acclimated to our presence. We're not doing anything threatening, we're just standing there. And that means they're more comfortable in coming out and going about their daily lives. It's important to recognize that humans, to most animals, read as predators. got forward-facing eyes, we show our teeth a lot. They have no reason to trust that we have good intentions. I mean, like, most of us aren't going to go and try and catch the birds that we're seeing, obviously, but it's important to recognize that the majority of the birds that we're watching do have to worry about predators. I mean, unless you're seeing a golden eagle, there are very few birds in our area here in the San Francisco Bay Area that don't have predators that they have to watch out for. So doing what you can to avoid predatory behavior, avoid sharp movements that are going to draw the bird's attention. If you see a bird, don't swing your arm out and point to it to show it to your friend, because one, that's not a super effective way of actually showing them where the bird is, unless they're violating social distancing rules and are right over your shoulder. It's a lot more effective to be able to describe where that bird is located. But it's also going to draw the attention of the bird to you, and that's not necessarily something you want. They're going to be wary about that, and if they're wary, you've run the risk of basically triggering a predator response of that bird. And there's two that are really obvious that most people know. Flight and fight, and the third is freeze. Now, flight is obvious. It's a bird. It's going to try and get out of the area as quickly as possible. That means you've got just a couple of seconds to get it in your binoculars and possibly ID it, but then it's gone. And that's not great if you're not sure what sort of bird it was, right? You got maybe a flash of tail feathers, and that's not a lot to ID a bird on. With fight, that's not something that we deal with a lot here, because we're not in Australia and we don't have cassowaries, which we're all pretty grateful for. But it's always a risk, pretty low. And then the third is freeze, and they'll go still. And that means you're not going to see them, because even though they're still in the area, theoretically you could find them. They're small, they're camouflaged, they're not moving. There's nothing to draw your eye to it unless you're willing to spend 20 to 30 minutes scanning every available inch, and even then, they might be hidden behind some leaves. So movement would have been the only way you would have been able to spot them anyway. So, when we're birding in the field, we're going to avoid sudden movements, we're going to avoid flinging our arms out. Now this is tricky for me because I talk with my hands, but we rein it in, we keep it close, and if we spot something in our binoculars, we're going to go nice and slow in a contained movement in order to see them. And that helps us avoid startling the birds that we're trying to see. But let's consider now the birds themselves. After all, we're not in this to watch people. It's important to pay attention to what we're doing in order to make sure we're being ethical birders, and in order to make sure we're being considerate in the field, and we're not, shooting ourselves in the foot with our own behavior when we're trying to find these birds. But let's take a look at the birds themselves. So sound is one of the best ways to find a bird. Really good birders can identify a bird based on the sounds that it's making. The calls, the songs, they can use that to ID a bird without ever seeing it. Now when you're just starting out, you're not going to be able to do that, and that's okay. That's a skill that takes a while. It takes a lot of experience to be able to build up. You need a lot of opportunities to spot the bird, put the sound to what you're seeing. But as a beginner birder, you can use those songs, those calls, to help direct you in what direction that bird is actually in. We've got ears on the left and right side of us. Many of us went through that hearing test when we were kids. You got on the bus and you put the giant headphones on and you said if the sound was coming from the right or the left. Use that ability. Figure out if a sound is coming from the right or the left, or maybe it's coming from directly above you and you need to take a couple steps back so you're not just seeing an unhelpful bird butt up in the sky. But those sounds will help you figure out where those birds are actually hanging out, and it'll keep you from wandering aimlessly around your local parks or neighborhoods. Walks are nice, but when we're out birding, we actually do want to see the birds instead of just walking around. Motion is another good thing to be paying attention to. The reason birders stand still a lot, one, it acclimates the birds to us, and two, it allows us to scan areas, and that's when you're looking without necessarily focusing your eyes, but you're just looking for any movement. And that movement could be the wind moving through the tree branches, but it could just as easily be a bird foraging for insects among those leaves. It could be birds that are getting into a fight with each other because it's springtime and they're territorial and, you know, grumpy. And that movement is really going to draw your eye. You're going to find that it's a lot easier to find any animal if it is moving versus if it is staying stock still. Once again, we don't want these animals to freeze on us. If they freeze, our chances of seeing them go way down. Now, location is another thing that we want to be concerned about when we're looking at our birds, or looking for our birds, rather. So I've got a picture here of the trail in Santa Teresa County Park. And this is a great area to bird. Right now there's lazuli buntings, there's goldfinches, there's ash-throated flycatchers. It's a great time, especially if you go early in the morning before everybody's out on the trail and it gets too hot. But when you're looking for birds in an area like this, one of the best places to pay attention to is actually the very edges of the trail. That's where you're going to see things like your sparrows, ground foraging birds, come up to the very edges of the trail to pick at bugs and seeds. If you're looking for a bird that's singing, it's probably going to be perched on a branch somewhere, and you're going to have better luck finding it by looking at the very tops and the edges of the tree line, rather than staring into the depths of the forest and searching out treebeard. Some things are more effective than others, and you kind of want to use your time judiciously. If you're searching out raptors, the sky is where you're going to be wanting to pay attention. They're going to be out soaring on the thermals rather than just hanging out in the middle of the field. So we're going to be paying attention to the location. And part of the location is also being observant of the needs of birds. So if it's a cold day, the birds are going to be looking for warm, sunny spots where they can warm up. If it's really hot out, if you're in a place like California where the summertime is just miserable hot and dry, water sources are your best friend for finding wildlife of any sort. There's a reason we set up field cams at watering sites. That's because all of the animals are going to have to pass through there at some point. So that's where we're going to get our best chance at seeing them. If you know that there are plants that are fruiting in your area, that's a good place to find animals that are foraging. There's food there. It's available to them. They're going to be visiting it at some point. So paying attention to your surroundings and remembering that the birds are, in fact, animals with biological needs that they need to satisfy is going to do you a world of good when you're going out and you're trying to find the birds. Another thing that's important to remember is the behavior itself. So you can use the behavior of birds themselves to your advantage. In most cases, the birds are going to find predators before you do. There's more of the birds out there than there are you. They are more used to paying attention to predators. Humans haven't had to worry about being actively hunted by a wild animal in a really long time. It's not a natural instinct for us anymore. But, as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that want to eat our birds right now. So, if all of a sudden the birds in your area go quiet, there might be a hawk in the area. If you suddenly have a mob of crows that are just cawing at the top of their lungs around a tree, odds are really good that they've found a hawk or an owl that they're very angry at and they want to try and drive away. If you're in an area like the Palo Alto Baylands or Charleston Slough, where we've got a ton of shorebirds that are going to be foraging pretty much all day, if you suddenly see that flock of shorebirds take off into the air, you should start looking for a falcon or a northern harrier, something that would have caused them to go up into the air, a predator that's trying to find its own lunch. So by learning those behavioral tics, those responses, you can become a better birder, and you're not just more effectively birding, but you're learning about the animals themselves. Once again, birding is a really great opportunity to learn more about nature. And if you're going at it from that direction, you're seldom going to be disappointed with any birding expedition, even if you didn't get your target bird. So, there's more, because there's always more. When you're doing anything in a naturalist-related field, there's always different factors that you can be looking at. Things just kind of unfold and then unfold more, and you've got suddenly a mess of all of these different factors that play into each other, but life is messy, and that's how it works. So things like season, the weather can impact what birds are in the area. The time of day you go birding can impact how many and what birds you see. Obviously, if you're birding at night, you're going to get things like poorwills, owls, and you're not necessarily going to be getting your sparrows and your finches calling. If you're birding and you're starting out and you're just like, wow, this birding thing sounds really great, but I don't want to be up at 5 in the morning. That sounds miserable. You don't have to be. I mean, there's great birding at 5 a.m. when the sun is rising. It's nice and quiet, so you can really focus on those bird sounds. But the birds are out pretty much all day. That being said, if you're starting your birding expedition at 3 p.m., you're gonna have a disappointing time. It's the hottest part of the day. Nobody wants to be out then, least of all the birds. So, today we're gonna be talking about everybody's favorite invasive species, our house sparrow. So, this is the house sparrow. This is the female house sparrow. And looking at this bird, you would be forgiven to just say, well, it's a little brown bird. There's nothing exciting there. And that's fair. It's kind of an insult to the bird itself, but it's a pretty fair assessment. The females are relatively bland, but you'll notice that they've got this big, heavy beak that's really great for cracking seeds. And that makes sense because these birds are seed eaters. So we're going to spot them foraging on the ground, visiting our bird feeders, and as the name implies, these birds are incredibly common around buildings. Now, this is an invasive species. The introduction of them was established in 1900. They're part of the storybook fable of the introduction of Shakespeare's birds to Central Park. And the reason I say fable because it's kind of muddy waters as to when they were actually successfully introduced. Certainly they were part of that effort, but that effort was mainly done in the late 1800s, and as I said, they weren't super well established until the 1900s. Regardless, these guys, and this is the male, so he looks quite a bit different and is far more easily picked out from our lineup of sparrows than the female is. These guys are a little bit problematic. So they're an invasive species, and we call them that because 1, they're introduced, and 2, they're capable of doing active harm to our ecosystems. These guys are cavity nesters, and if you're familiar with Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, you might be aware that one of our ongoing conservation projects is the Cavity Nesters Recovery Program. One of the reasons we have to have this program is because these cute little guys here. They love nesting in cavities. More often than not, those are man-made cavities, so you guys can find them nesting in broken outdoor lights, in the eaves of houses, pretty much anywhere they can shove a bunch of grass and lay their eggs. But they can be aggressive to our native species, to the point of even attacking native nesting birds like our western bluebird, our swallows, So they're problematic, and we often find ourselves having to remove nests so that our native species can actually make use of the habitat that we're providing. We don't want to be fostering more non-native species than the native ones. But they're pretty cool to watch. They're definitely a common bird. They're found in every state of the US except Alaska. It gets too cold for them there. But they're very, very well established, very widespread. But it's interesting because you can actually pick out their social pecking order, if you will, pretty easily. There's a great indicator on the males here on that chest, that black bib. The size correlates with where they're placed in that social order, who's establishing the dominance. So the larger that chest patch is, the more dominant the bird is, and the easier time he has of finding a mate. But they're a good one to know if just so you can ID them and get them out of the way so that you can spend more time sussing out which of our many native sparrows you can possibly see, and there's a wide variety of that. I don't recommend ever starting with the sparrows as a beginning birder, just because you're going to get overwhelmed by all of the small brown birds with lots of tiny details that set them apart. Putting together a dichotomous key is a great trick for learning your sparrows, because it'll be things like, does it have a striped chest or a plain chest, which will lead you eventually to what exact species it is, and you'll be shocked at how many different kinds we have. So get the house sparrow out of the way so you can reliably ID it, both the male and the female, and then you can move on to more exciting native species. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope you all have a great holiday weekend. Not that changes much, but stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful rest of your day.